Welcome back to Press TV News. In Canada, a prominent tribal chief says she will end her 6-week hunger strike over Aboriginal rights. Theresa Spence made the decision after opposition parties and Indigenous leaders signed a declaration spelling out 13 specific demands they will present to the government. The declaration calls for improvements to housing and schools on reserves. It also calls for an immediate meeting between the Crown, the federal and provincial governments, and all First Nations to discuss treaty and non-treaty related relationships. Spence launched the hunger strike in December to pressure the government into meeting the Aboriginals' demands. The decision spurred a grassroots protest across the country. Press TV's Joshua Blakeney, our correspondent, joins me from Calgary. Joshua, Chief Theresa Spence's hunger strike brought to the foreground the forgotten issue of Aborigines' plight in Canada. What else do we know about the Aborigines' demands, their demands that they've put forward? And what is the chance that the Canadian federal government respect these demands and guarantee them?
Well, the Harper government left Theresa Spence to starve to death. And it's only been the fact that her supporters have now persuaded her to desist from her hunger strike that has prevented her from dying. And so evidently the Harper government doesn't give a stuff about the plight of Canada's Aboriginal peoples. They want to be treated on a nation-to-nation basis, just as, for example, in the European Union, France relates to Germany on a nation-to-nation basis. So Canada's Aboriginals would like to envisage a Canada which would be consistent with Canadian law, incidentally, that exists like the European Union, where Aboriginals relate to Canada, to the Crown, to the Canadian state on a nation-to-nation basis. And that is the crux of this 13-point demand. There is also a demand to have the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples implemented fully in Canada. Now, it's very revealing that the whole world basically in 2007 in the United Nations endorsed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, apart from New Zealand, Australia, Canada and the United States. And of course, all those countries have problems, have this skeleton in their closet of the Indigenous question. And so we now see opposition parties finally rallying behind, unambiguously rallying behind Theresa Spence to support these demands, which actually are consistent with Canadian law and going back in Canada's history to British imperial law, that Indigenous peoples be consented or be consulted with, and that their consent be extracted prior to any decisions being made on their historic territories. Now, it's evident that Canada is a resource superpower. China and the United States in particular are devouring Canada's resources, and the Indigenous peoples of Canada want their fair share. And Theresa Spence is fed up with right-wing journalists in Canada delegitimizing and attacking Canada's Aboriginal peoples, portraying them as terrorists and dehumanizing them in a way that the Nazis did, dehumanizing Aboriginal peoples and making Canadians view them in a stigmatized manner. And we saw a hunger strike take place in Canada, and these demands have been issued, but it's yet to be seen whether the Harper government will respond to them. The opposition parties have been quite slow to come to the table because obviously the center of gravity is shifting in Canada under the Harper government to the right. And so the opposition parties themselves, many would say, have failed, but finally have agreed to these 13 demands. And it will be yet to be seen whether the Harper government will take any notice of them or will continue to kowtow to the interests of resource companies who profit lucratively from the despoilation of the resources that lie in the hinterland in Canada, underneath the historic territories of Canada's Indigenous peoples. Idle no more, we must note, is not necessarily synonymous with Chief Theresa Spence. She was a component of it, but just because Chief Theresa Spence has now stopped her hunger strike and will go back to eating regular meals, that doesn't mean that Idle No More will stop proliferating throughout Canada and throughout the world. I met and interviewed Calgarian leaders of Idle No More today, and they were certainly planning future events. I know on Monday there's going to be a national day of protest for Idle No More, and so it's not, we shouldn't assume that just because Theresa Spence is going back to normal food that Idle No More will dissipate. I think that the evidence suggests that the discontent is swirling in Canada, and people are upset with the Harper government for many reasons. One, namely this Bill C-45, which only had one Aboriginal component, which was bad enough. But this Bill C-45 makes radical changes to almost every aspect of Canadian society. And so now you're seeing Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians linking arms to try effectively to oust the Harper regime, which I remind Press TV viewers was exposed to have seized a majority of seats in Canada's parliament through election fraud in 2011. And so I think many would like to see these opposition parties, which have now endorsed Theresa Spence's 13-point plan, would like to see them come into power and the Harper government step down from power, having embarrassed itself time and time again since its majority of seats in 2011.
Indeed. Press TV's Joshua Blakeney, our correspondent, reporting from Calgary there. Joshua, thanks. Well, North Korea says it will conduct a new nuclear test and more rocket launches aimed at the United States. The National Defense Commission in Pyongyang warns of a